Imagine for a moment that Christopher Columbus never set sail in 1492, or that his ships are lost at sea, or that he simply turns back after weeks of empty ocean. The year is still 1492, but the New World remains unknown to Europe. No Spanish conquest, no Portuguese Brazil, no English, French, or Dutch colonies. How would our world look today? Would history have taken a completely different path? Or would someone else have eventually found those continents anyway? The more you let this question sink in, the more it pulls you in. Because the discovery of America was not just one event. It was the spark that ignited centuries of global transformation, cultural exchange, disease, conquest, and the rise of the modern world. Stay with me until the very end, because as we explore the four most plausible alternate histories of what could have happened if Columbus never discovered America, you'll see just how fragile our timeline really is, and how one small change could have reshaped everything we know. Let's begin with the least likely scenario. America is never discovered by anyone, and the two hemispheres remain completely isolated from each other indefinitely. This is the least probable outcome, because Europe in the late 15th century was already in the middle of an age of exploration. Portugal and Spain were leading the way, but other nations were watching closely. For example, in 1500, the Portuguese explorer Pedro Álvares Cabral accidentally discovered Brazil while sailing to India and immediately claimed it for Portugal. Even if Columbus had failed, the momentum of exploration was too strong to stop. But let's assume, for the sake of this scenario, that no European power dares to sail into the unknown Atlantic. What would the Americas look like without any contact with the Old World? At the beginning of the 16th century, three major civilizations were flourishing in the Americas. In Mesoamerica, the Aztec Empire, also known as the Mexica, had expanded dramatically in just 100 years, controlling much of what is today central Mexico through a sophisticated military organization and a harsh tribute system imposed on conquered peoples. Further south, the Inca Empire had built one of the most impressive administrative states in the pre-modern world. Their greatest strengths were an extraordinary road network connecting distant cities across the Andes and a highly efficient system of terrace agriculture that allowed them to farm steep mountain slopes. In the Yucatan and Central America, the Maya civilization had already passed its classical peak and was in decline due to prolonged droughts, environmental stress, and internal conflicts. But it still maintained advanced cities and knowledge systems. Without European arrival, it is very likely that the Aztecs would have continued their southward expansion and eventually subjugated or heavily influenced the remaining Maya city-states. The continent would probably have been divided between two great powers, the Aztecs in the north and the Incas in the south, with smaller, independent peoples surviving in the most remote areas. The main point of potential conflict would have been Central America, particularly the Darien Gap, a dense, swampy jungle region that even today has no road connecting North and South America. This natural barrier would have made large-scale military campaigns extremely difficult, so the two empires might have respected a de facto border there for centuries. Population-wise, there would have been no shortage of manpower. The Inca Empire had around 12 million people, while the Aztec Empire had approximately 6 million. For comparison, Spain at that time had about 5 million, and Portugal only 1 million. Both American empires had enough labor to farm the land and maintain complex societies. On the other side of the Atlantic, Europe would have continued exploring the African coast with even greater intensity. The rivalry with the Ottoman Empire, which controlled much of North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, would have grown much sharper. Spain, Portugal, and the Ottomans would likely have carved up the most desirable parts of Africa, while England, France, and the Netherlands might have been left with the less accessible or more hostile regions. Without the wealth and resources from the Americas, the so-called European miracle, the rapid scientific, technological, and economic rise that eventually led to global dominance, would have been significantly delayed. The Columbian Exchange, which brought potatoes, corn, tomatoes, chocolate, and many other crops to Europe, and wheat, horses, and cattle to the Americas, would never have happened. Europeans would have missed out on key foods that helped fuel population growth, while Native Americans would have been spared the devastating diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, that killed up to 90% of their population in some regions. The two hemispheres might have remained ignorant of each other until the invention of aviation or even space exploration. The first clear images of Earth from above came in 1946 with suborbital flights. Without the cultural and technological acceleration caused by the discovery of America, we might still be decades behind in space technology, meaning the existence of the other continent could have remained unknown much longer. Now let's move to the second scenario, which is slightly more plausible but still unlikely. America discovers the rest of the world instead. This is difficult to imagine because the American civilizations, despite their sophistication, had been isolated for millennia and lacked the same level of cumulative technological exchange that occurred across Eurasia via the Silk Road and other trade routes. The shape of the continents also played a crucial role. Eurasia stretches horizontally across similar latitudes, making it easier to spread crops, animals, and ideas. America is oriented vertically, so moving crops or domesticated animals between very different climates was much harder. For example, corn never spread from North to South America in a meaningful way before European contact, and animals like the llama never moved north. Still, if Europe had never ventured west, it is possible that over many centuries, the more advanced American civilizations, particularly the Aztecs or Incas, might have eventually developed the naval technology to cross the oceans. If they had sailed east across the Pacific, they might have encountered Asia. If they sailed northeast, they might have reached Europe. But the result would likely have been similar to what actually happened, just reversed. Devastating disease exchange, conquest or conflict, and eventual cultural blending. The huge population advantage of Eurasia, China alone had over 100 million people, would have made a successful American conquest of Europe or Asia extremely difficult in the long run. Let's move to the third scenario. Asia discovers America. This is more plausible than the previous two because China was a major maritime power in the early 15th century. Between 1405 and 1433, Admiral Zheng He led 7 massive treasure voyages with fleets that dwarfed anything Europe had at the time. These expeditions reached East Africa and established diplomatic and trade relations. China had the compass, gunpowder, and advanced shipbuilding technology. However, after 1433, the voyages stopped, likely due to internal court politics and a shift toward isolationism. If one of those later expeditions had pushed further east across the Pacific, it is possible China could have reached the Americas. But the Pacific's currents made eastward travel extremely difficult, until the route was properly understood in the 1560s. Even if China had found America, their approach would likely have been different from Europe's. The Chinese were generally more interested in trade and diplomacy than conquest and colonization. They might have established trading posts rather than empires. Still, disease exchange would have occurred, and once Europe learned of the new lands and their riches, they would have sailed west with the same results we know from history. We now come to the most likely scenario, and the one with the greatest historical weight. Another European country discovers America instead of Spain. Even if Columbus had failed or never sailed, the momentum of exploration in the late 15th and early 16th centuries was too strong to stop. Portugal was already pushing down the African coast and rounding the Cape of Good Hope. Cabral accidentally found Brazil in 1500 while heading to India. England, France, and the Netherlands were watching closely and would soon launch their own expeditions. Someone was almost certainly going to find the American continents within a few decades. The big question is, which country discovers it first, and how would that change the course of history? Each European power brought a different model of colonization, with major differences in labor systems, treatment of indigenous peoples, interracial marriage, education, and long-term cultural impact. Let's start with forced labor and slavery. Spain issued the laws of Burgos in 1512 and the new laws in 1542, which, at least on paper, aimed to protect indigenous people and outlaw their enslavement. The Spanish then adapted the Inca mita system of rotational forced labor. When demand grew, they turned to African slaves. Portugal, focused on sugar plantations in Brazil, also failed to make indigenous labor work effectively and quickly shifted to importing massive numbers of African slaves, making Brazil the world's largest sugar producer by the late 16th century. The English initially tried various forms of servitude with both Native Americans and indentured English servants, but both groups frequently escaped or rebelled. This pushed England heavily toward African slavery, especially in the Caribbean and southern colonies. France, Denmark, Sweden, and the Netherlands all participated in the Atlantic slave trade to varying degrees. No matter which European nation discovered America first, the catastrophic population decline caused by Old World diseases would have forced them to rely on African slave labor. The only historical anomaly is that Spain passed laws attempting to protect indigenous people relatively early, something that did not happen in the English colonies until centuries later. The approach to the indigenous population also differed sharply. In 1514, Spain issued a royal decree allowing marriage between Spaniards and natives. In 1967, 453 years later, the United States finally legalized interracial marriage nationwide. In Spanish America, mixing began almost immediately. Of the 171 Spaniards living in Santo Domingo in 1514, 64 were already married to indigenous women. Many marriages were strategic alliances with local nobility, but many others were not. In 1537, when Spaniards founded Asunción in Paraguay, local Guarani offered their daughters in exchange for military protection. This created one of the most mestizo societies in the Americas, where Guarani is still widely spoken today. In contrast, English settlers usually arrived as families, making intermarriage less common. North American indigenous societies were smaller and more mobile, making integration harder. Laws against interracial marriage appeared in Virginia as early as 1691. The English experience in Ireland, where they viewed the Irish as barbarians, shaped their attitude toward Native Americans, whom they saw in a similar light. Portugal saw extensive mixing in Brazil, producing large numbers of mestizos and caboclos. France had some mixing in Canada, the Métis, though on a smaller scale. Overall, countries with over 50% mestizo or indigenous population today are almost all former Spanish colonies. Countries with less than 5% are mostly English-speaking. Education followed similar patterns. Spain founded its first university in the Americas in 1538 in Santo Domingo and established around 30 universities across the continent, enrolling up to 150,000 students, including mestizos and some indigenous nobles. England founded Harvard in 1636, but its early attempt to educate Native Americans was largely unsuccessful. France opened its first university in the Americas much later, in 1982. Portugal and the Dutch built almost none. If another country had discovered and colonized most of America, the cultural and demographic map would look very different today. Portugal would likely have produced a heavily mixed society similar to Brazil. France might have done the same in some regions. England would probably have created more racially segregated societies with much less mestizaje. The Netherlands would have focused on trade and plantations with heavy reliance on slavery. In my view, if Spain had not been the dominant colonizer, Portugal would have been the next best option for a more mixed and culturally blended outcome, followed by France, then England, with the Netherlands last. As a final reflection, atrocities occurred under every colonial power, as they did in the Aztec and Inca empires, in Africa and in Asia. It was the 16th century. We must understand the context of the time rather than judge it solely by modern standards. What we should do instead is appreciate the rich, intertwined cultures that emerged and recognize the potential of our shared history. And you? Which of these 4 scenarios would you have preferred? Would you rather America remained unknown, that the Americas discovered Europe, that Asia found the New World, or that another European power took Spain's place? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this exploration of alternate history has made you think differently about how fragile our timeline really is, and how one voyage changed the world, then take a moment right now to hit the subscribe button and join our community. We regularly dive into deep historical reconstructions and fascinating what-if scenarios grounded in real evidence. And here's my personal request. Share this video with exactly one person you genuinely care about, a friend or family member who shares your curiosity about history and loves thoughtful discussions about how the past could have been different. It takes only a second, but it helps these ideas reach more open-minded people. Thank you for watching all the way through. History is not inevitable. It is shaped by choices, luck, disease, technology, and timing. The discovery of America was one of those rare pivot points that redirected the course of humanity. Understanding what might have been helps us appreciate what actually happened, and reminds us to think carefully about the decisions we make today. If you enjoyed this, leave a like, drop your favorite scenario in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video as we continue exploring the roads not taken in history.